Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on new scholarship on U.S. intelligence and feature two books, Nicholas Reynolds' Need to Know, World War II and the Rise of American Intelligence, and Thomas Boghart's Covert Legions, U.S. Army Intelligence in Germany, 1944 to 1949, and our discussant this afternoon is Genevieve Lester of the U.S. Army War College. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague and fellow co-chair, Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. For over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center and since the pandemic and, well, post-pandemic era here in the virtual realm. And if you have your calendars out, please take note. Next Monday, the Washington History Seminar feature William Inboden's just published book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible. Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center, and Rachel Wheatley of the American Historical Association. And on the logistics front, please note, today's session is being recorded, and it can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We will call on as many folks as we can. And with those preliminaries out of the way, let me turn to our moderator, my co-host, Christian Osterman, who will introduce our speakers. Christian.
Thanks so much, Eric. Just a quick correction to your announcement. Next week's session will be on Thursday, not on Monday. So, but you'll remind us at the end of this session. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome our panelists and introduce our speakers here today. I'll do that in turn and then give them the floor, and then eventually hope to involve all of you in the audience in our discussion this afternoon or this evening. I'm coming to you from Berlin. So with that, let me turn first. We'll first go to Dr. Nicholas Reynolds, who served as an officer in charge of field history for the U.S. Marine Corps and as a historian for the CIA Museum at Langley. He is a retired he's now retired, independent scholar. His varied career has taken him from Oxford University, where he obtained his DPhil, to the U.S. Marine Corps and the CIA. Among his earlier writings, two favorites of his stand out: Treason Was No Crime, a biography of General Ludwig Beck, the head of the German resistance to Hitler, and Writer, Sailor, Soldier, Spy, The Secret Adventures of Ernest Hemingway, 1935 to 1961, published in 2017. Today, he will discuss his new book, Need to Know, World War II and the Rise of American Intelligence. Nick, a warm welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity and want to greet my fellow historians and the audience. I want to start with a couple words in thanks to the historian who gave me the idea for this book about 10 or 15 years ago, and that was David Kahn. We were talking one day about the state of historiography of World War II intelligence, and David said, you know, nobody's ever written a one-volume history of American intelligence in World War II. And that was a challenge that I had to persuade myself to take. I thought I would spend the rest of my life doing it, frankly, but it only occupied a mere 5 years. So here we are, and I want to once again express my thanks to colleagues like David Kahn, who was at Oxford with me. So I'm going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes about the book and really give you a quick overview of the book. The book itself is an overview. I call it a look at American intelligence from 1940 to 1946 at the 30,000 foot level. Being at that level enables us to take in more than one kind of intelligence and to discern big picture trends. That is what distinguishes this book from the hundreds of other good books on American intelligence in World War II, most of which tend to be about one kind of intelligence. What I've done is look at the various species, try to see who contributed what and how they interacted. I argue there's an arc from Pearl Harbor to D-Day, from performance at close to the level, close to null, 0, to well over 50%, not 100%, maybe you never get to 100%, but I'd say by D-Day, American intelligence along with British intelligence was functioning quite well. So we moved from failure to success. By the end of World War II, we can discern the foundations of post-war intelligence as well as the strengths and shortcomings that the country would experience during the Cold War when it came to intelligence. How did I gather material for this book? Well, I started, thankfully, before the pandemic, research in published sources as well as the archives. Being Washington-based is a blessing. National Archives is just down the road, and a number of other archives are within easy reach. The pandemic was a distinct impediment, but not a showstopper. I already had a great deal of material and found a great deal more online. In fact, the pandemic forced me to look in places online that I would not have looked and expected to find original sources. I have to applaud the archives and libraries that are digitizing collections that made this kind of work possible, like the FDR Library, which has over 800,000 pages of documents online. So once I had the material, how did I organize it? Well, I think historians divide into two kinds, the organizers and the let's give it a try and see what happens. I'm somewhere in between. I'm closer to the let's give it a try and see what happens. After working in intelligence and history for a while, I had a general idea of what I wanted to do, and I knew what the important points, I knew what I wanted to cover, and I knew generally what issues I would have to address, and then I decided the narrative would pivot around them. I started writing and, of course, revising, and tried to let the material speak for itself as much as possible. I wanted to tell the story through the eyes of the actual participants. I wanted the book to be as much about people as the institutions they served. So I often get asked what surprises emerged from my research that are in this book. Are there any dramatic new revelations? Did I discover, this is an evergreen question, did I discover that Roosevelt and Churchill had known about Pearl Harbor all along and just let it happen? Did I find a new Soviet spy in the White House or the Pentagon, perhaps a senior whom no one had ever suspected? The answer to these questions is no. But I did uncover large patterns, which I think constitute a new way of looking at this subject and show what the principles themselves really cared about from President Roosevelt on down. One theme that emerges, I think, very clearly from the material is how much the admirals and the generals came to rely on the truly spectacular signals intelligence they received during the war. So much so that by the end of the war, the one thing they all could agree on was that signals intelligence should continue quietly in the background, doing its job after the guns fell silent. Other forms of intelligence, notably human, paled in comparison with signals intelligence, but there was a perceived need for them. One stream of reporting is never enough, especially since it could go dark. And there was also a perceived need for some way of centralizing American intelligence. Towards the end of the book, I describe the battle royal over what those other streams should be and how they should be integrated. As I focused on the greatest generation, I looked at both familiar and unfamiliar characters. At the beginning of the war, we see something of a heyday of the loners, the men who persevered and achieved great things despite the system, which had done little to support them before Pearl Harbor. They include a particular hero of mine, who's Joe Rochefort, who's the Navy intel chief at Pearl Harbor, a man working out of a dungeon with poor ventilation and who had not finished high school. He had not been to the Naval Academy or any other college, but he had learned Japanese. He had learned a little bit about code breaking and a lot about traffic analysis, mostly on his own, without much help from anyone else. And on top of this, he didn't always get along with his superiors. And yet he's the guy who manages to develop the information that enabled the victory at Midway, and with some help from his colleagues, come up with a way to get the consumers to accept this information. Another character I particularly became attached to was William F. Friedman, the code-breaking pioneer who worked for the Army as he continued to do his job while struggling with depression and alcohol. A couple of dark horses emerge from the pack in this book. One is Secretary of War Stimson, the man who's famous for saying, "Gentlemen don't read each other's mail," which is something that he said around 1930 as he disbanded the Dark Chamber that was running in the 20s. But here in this story, he emerges as one of the principal supporters of code breaking in World War II. And at the same time, he's one of William J. Donovan's patrons as Donovan promotes a new way of warfare in Washington. Stimson supported yet another figure who plays an important role in this book and who is unknown to many readers and students of World War II. That is the Wall Street lawyer, Alfred T. McCormick, who devised a system for turning intercepts into intelligence. That made him a transitional figure in my eyes as we moved away from the loners who succeed despite the system to entrepreneurs who are forging a new system. So what was McCormick's story? And it is, let's see. It starts in, so he's a Wall Street lawyer, got rich during the Depression, which you did by handling bankruptcies and enabling companies to restructure to continue operations. He's in the elite law firm Cravath, Swaine & Moore, which is the elite of the elite, really. And Stimson and McCloy, his assistant, are cut from the same cloth. They all know each other. They've all worked together up on Wall Street. And after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Stimson wonders whether there's anything that we missed in the decodes, the Japanese traffic that had been broken before Pearl Harbor. He does not want any such loose ends going forward. He doesn't really know what he's looking for, but he's got a sense of when we find it, we'll know it. McCloy says, why don't you bring this man McCormick to Washington? He has the skills that you're looking for. He will be able to analyze the situation, propose a solution, and that's exactly what happens. McCormick gives up his lucrative law practice, comes to Washington within 2 weeks, and starts to analyze the way the U.S. processes intercepts. And he sees something that had not really occurred to anybody before that, and that was that what they were doing was circulating basically raw decrypts. So they were intercepted, decrypted, translated, and then what appeared to be the important ones were carried to the decision makers. But they were handed to the decision makers for only a few minutes and then taken back. Friedman said this was like looking at individual frames of a movie rather than the whole movie itself. And what McCormick was able to do was to make and show movies that would deliver comprehensive stories to the decision makers, to put the decrypts in context. He did this by bringing about 100 lawyers from his law firm, Cravath, Swaine & Moore, and his theory was that these are the only people who are smart enough to do the job. The military intelligence was too important to be left to the military. That's almost verbatim what he has said in his writings. And he was right about the lawyers being able to do this work. and they sifted through masses of material, turned them into something like finished intel. I say this is one of the high points of US intelligence in World War II, and perhaps the high point. So where does this leave OSS? When I told people that I was working about a book on an American intelligence in World War II, almost everyone said, oh, so you're going to write another book about OSS. And that's not the case. Yes, OSS is in this book, but it is not mostly about OSS. OSS figures in the book. Of course, it's a part of the story. And those who admire William J. Donovan will not feel that he's been neglected. Some people may feel that he's been a little maligned in this book. I think the facts speak for themselves. I offer my own interpretation of Donovan, which differs from a number of others. He's still a World War I hero with his Medal of Honor, a Wall Street lawyer who was a Republican internationalist, and a well-connected Anglophile. But I shade the picture a little differently from others, bringing in the testimony of one of his senior advisors, a man named James Grafton Rogers, who kept a diary while he was serving in Washington. Intel officers are discouraged, especially in wartime, from keeping diaries, but historians want to reach back through time and embrace them for doing so. And this is a little gem that I think has been neglected over the years. From these sources, Donovan emerges as less of an intelligence visionary, more of a man of action, especially in the early days of the war. In 1940 and 41, early 42, he wanted to support Britain and get the US involved, but he was looking for a combat job for himself, something like commanding a division, despite his age and lack of current experience. It was the British who had to come over and persuade him that that was not a good use of his time and to groom him for his role as impresario of American intelligence. So even though Donovan never gave up his urge to ride to the sound of the guns, he did establish COI and then OSS. And we see as he is in office, we see this theme that runs through the whole book, and it's a struggle between special operations and secret intelligence. That is, between guerrillas and spies. Where are we going to put our main effort? Donovan continuously leaned towards the paramilitary side of things, wanting to get his men into action and wanting to be in action himself, even when it was wildly inappropriate for him to do so. So he more than once he disobeyed orders and exposed himself on the front lines. Rogers, my diarist, describes how frustrated he became with his charming boss, who seemed to be advancing on multiple fronts at the same time. In his diary, Rogers, who was from the West, he's primarily a Coloradan, wrote about the near impossibility of harnessing what he called Donovan's Mustang plunges. I'm thinking that's a great title for an article someday. Under Donovan's charismatic but erratic leadership, OSS ran the risk of trying to do too much at once and achieving less than it could have by narrowing its focus. The tension was largely unresolved at the end of the war, as were nagging questions about just how much leeway the country should permit its secret services. Donovan himself had a disturbing tendency to act as if the rules didn't apply to him, as if results were more important than procedures. This set a worrisome example for future generations of intelligence officers. In the end, though, even Rogers had to give Donovan credit for awakening Washington to the potential of intelligence, a new dimension of warfare that the US had neglected for too long. When Harry S. Truman sent Donovan home in the fall of 1945, the president did not dismiss the old warrior's ideas for central intelligence. And that's where my story ends in the early days of January 1946, as we take the first steps on the road to the post-war intelligence community that we know today. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Thomas Boghardt, who is a senior historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD in modern European history also from the University of Oxford, held a research fellowship at Georgetown from 2002 to 2004, and served as the historian of the International Spy Museum from 2004 to 2010. An award-winning author, he is currently writing the second volume of the official history of the U.S. Army intelligence in Germany, 1949 to 1961. The first volume, Covert Legions, U.S. Army Intelligence in Germany, 1944 to 49, published earlier this year, is what he will speak to us about now. Welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Thomas, Zoom room is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Christian. It's a great pleasure to be here. The first thing I'll do is I'll put up a slide. I just have one, but I think it'll be helpful for the presentation. I hope you can see it all. Should be a map of occupied Germany, and I'm starting the slideshow now. There we go. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I do want to start off by just expressing my gratitude to the Wilson Center, Eric Arneson, especially Christian Osterman, for hosting this event. I mean, this has been a long time in the making. I remember, Christian, we were talking about it last year, and here we are finally. It's really great that this is coming together. Thanks also to my very good friend, Nick Reynolds, for doing this jointly with me. His book is excellent, highly recommended. If you don't have it already, do go out and buy it. And also thank you to Jen Lester for commenting on our talks. You know, before I started, I looked at Nick's and my book, and I think it's a combined about 1,000 pages, and you had to read all that. So kudos to you. I look forward to your comments and then our discussion. Yeah, the combination of our talks, Nick, is really a perfect mix, right? Because yours ends at the end of the war, and this is where my book, Covert Legions, U.S. Army Intelligence in Germany, picks up. So at the end of the war, just a little bit of a background, because not everybody might be as familiar with this period as people are with World War II. So obviously, Germany loses this war. And in 1944 and 1945 comes under a joint Allied occupation. And if you can all take a quick look at the map, the country, what remains of it, is divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, British, American, and French. And this is the political order in Central Europe until 1949. But this is also a time of tremendous change. In 1945, the wartime alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States is still very much intact. The Americans don't necessarily expect this to change, but it does change, and it changes dramatically. By 1946, 1947, this wartime alliance has largely unraveled. And these two superpowers become competitors. By 1949, we're looking at a very different world order. We now have what we call the Cold War, the world being divided into 2 blocks: a Soviet bloc in the east, an American-led Federation of States in the west. And the dividing line between these two runs straight through Germany and the city of Berlin. And in a way, this is the central theme of my book. You know, what is the role of intelligence in all this? So Germany wasn't necessarily the cause, or even the most important cause, for the Cold War, but I think if you look at the map, you'll see it was absolutely central for this unfolding Cold War. And I think it's also a very important locus to understand how this Cold War came about. So this occupation that we're talking about was a military occupation. And this term military occupation has important implications for who is doing what in Germany. In the American zone, the US Army was in charge. The US Army ran this occupation. The US Army executed all American policies in Germany. And the head of not only the top military commander, but also the top political authority in Germany was an army general, General Lucius Declassified. This means that all aspects of the occupation were handled by the army, and that includes intelligence. So some people, may look at the title of my book and see the term U.S. Army intelligence and think about it as a very narrow area, but in fact, we're talking about all aspects of intelligence in Germany at this time that includes signals intelligence. And by the way, Nick, I agree with you about the importance of signals intelligence. This was one of my findings as well. Signals intelligence, espionage, the monitoring of mail, of telephone calls, aerial reconnaissance. All these things were done by U.S. Army intelligence agencies in Germany. Incidentally, the Army also supervised during this time the CIA in Germany. The CIA had a very telling cover name. It was called the Department of the Army Detachment. This is the name that they adopted in Germany. And again, Nick, I had to, I was very fascinated by your talk. My findings were exactly the same. During these early years, the CIA is really an organization that's in the making, but it does not play the central role that we sometimes ascribe to it, perhaps just like the OSS in World War II. It's a big name, but it takes a while to really come into its own. At this point, it's really the US Army that takes the lead on intelligence operations. I'm going to talk about a few of those operations briefly, but I also want to speak a little bit about the personnel, the individual officials who worked for Army intelligence in Germany during those years. And I found that fascinating because many of them are actually not born Americans. They are Americans of German extraction. There are people like someone you have all heard of, Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is a typical example. So Henry Kissinger, as you may know, was originally from Germany. He left the country in the 1930s with his family as a young man or child and came to the United States. When war broke out, he was drafted into the US Army because of his language skills. He spoke perfect German, of course. He ended up in Army intelligence. And then he comes back to Germany as an Army intelligence official at the end of the war. And there were many people like him, German immigrants, people who, many of them Jewish, who, because of their cultural and their language knowledge, then worked in Army intelligence in Germany at the end of the war and during the occupation. And these people were absolutely central in making this occupation work. They were a critical link between the occupation authorities and intelligence and what was going on in Germany on the ground. And again, Kissinger is a big name, but there were many others like him. So in terms of operations, I think it's fair to say that Army intelligence was really involved in most occupation policies that were conducted. So for instance, if you think about Denazification, again, a term that I'm sure you're familiar with, the removal of German officials who were compromised by their work with the Nazis, and then their replacement by officials who were seen as pro-democratic and willing to work with the Americans. All of this was handled by Army intelligence. So for instance, the first chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, he was identified by Army intelligence in 1944 and was then appointed mayor of Cologne, eventually became the chancellor. Theodor Heuss, who then became the first president of Germany in 1949, also was located by Army intelligence officials even before the end of the war. He briefly worked as an informant for the Counterintelligence Corps and then became president. Willy Brandt, who later became chancellor of West Germany, also worked as an informant for the Counterintelligence Corps for several years in Berlin. And there are many others, but you can see how these activities of Army intelligence really had an impact on this emerging West German state. Another operation where Army intelligence played the central role was Project Paperclip. And again, some of you may have heard the name. This was the recruitment of German scientists at the end of the war who would then end up working for the American military or for American industry. Perhaps the biggest name was Wernher von Braun, a rocket scientist who was captured at the end. I mean, he surrendered, but he came into an American camp at the end of the war, and then eventually was transferred to the United States, and he helped put the first man on the moon. So that was Project Paperclip. Operation Rusty, the creation of a proto-German intelligence service under the supervision of the US Army. The idea here was that the Army would recruit former German intelligence officers who would then, on behalf of the Americans, collect information on the Soviets. This operation evolved into the BND, which remains the German Foreign Intelligence Service today. So again, a very consequential operation by Army intelligence at the end of the war. A few words also on the role of Army intelligence in this changing relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. And again, this is one of the central themes of my book. So as I said earlier, in 1945, this relationship is still largely intact. The Soviets deploy a very large occupation force in their sector, in the eastern part of Germany. A little over 300,000 soldiers that remain there until 1949. In 1945, from Washington's perspective, that is not a big deal because the two countries are still allied. But as this relationship unravels, of course, having such a massive presence of Red Army troops in the center of Europe is a big deal, especially since the US Army was demobilizing. There wasn't really anything, that could have conventionally opposed the Soviets. So American policy makers really want to know what are the Soviets up to. It was very difficult to get information out of the Soviet Union. The USSR was a closed society. It was very difficult to conduct intelligence operations there. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, was someone who was very difficult to read. So what ends up happening is that much of the information that American policy towards the Soviets is based on during these years ends up coming from Germany. Army intelligence is able, and really beginning at the end of the war in 1945, starts collecting information on the Soviets in East Germany through various means: signals intelligence, espionage, and especially interrogation of refugees. This was their main source of information. You had millions of people fleeing from the Soviet bloc for economic reasons or political oppression coming to the West. Most of them ended up in refugee camps in the American zone. And here, Army intelligence interrogators systematically interviewed them, on their background, on what they had seen during their journey and so forth, and pieced this together. And the information, the picture that emerged was actually pretty accurate, gave the Americans a very good idea of what the Soviets were doing, what was going on in the Soviet zone, and also on the deployment of the order of battle of the Soviet forces there. To the extent that American policy was guided and based on intelligence coming from Europe, it actually ended up being intelligence coming from Germany, not from the Soviet Union, because in Germany, the Iron Curtain was penetrable. So those are just some of the operations that I talk about. We can discuss them perhaps in more depth in the Q&A session. But I also want to make a final point, because this is really a panel about not only Germany, but about American intelligence. So the occupation had an impact on, of course, on the future of Germany and German-American relations. It also had a tremendous impact on the emerging American intelligence community. In 1947, the National Security Act creates the CIA, the National Security Council, essentially the nucleus of what our intelligence community is today. And of course, 1947, that's smack in the middle of the time period that we're looking at here. And when you look at the leading personalities, the biographies of these intelligence officials who lead this community in the CIA, in particular in the 1950s and 1960s, you'll find time and again that they gained their first experience in Germany, especially in post-war Germany. So for instance, Alan Dulles, DCI in the 1950s, he was the first station chief in occupied Germany in 1945. At that point, it was still called the OSS. Same with Richard Helms, another station chief in Germany who gained his operational experience in the late 1940s. Harry Rositsky, Bob Weisner, who headed a covert action program, Peter Zickel. These were all men who molded the CIA and American intelligence, but they gained their experience in Germany. Same with Bill Harvey, legendary CIA chief in the 1950s. So this was really a two-way street. This was an impactful time for Germany and German-American relations, but I think it's also fair to say it was really, it shaped this emerging American intelligence community as it evolved in the 1950s and the 1960s. That's all I have for now. I'll very much look forward to Jen's comments and then to the Q&A session.
Great, thank you very much. Thomas, if you can, yes, great. Excellent. Well, before I introduce our commentator today, our discussant, let me remind you all in the audience, and we have a formidable and a sizable audience this afternoon, that you can participate in our discussion in two ways. Our preference is for you to chime in directly, at least with your voice by using the raise hand function, and then you'll be queued, and I'll call on you when it's time for you to pose your question or comment. Or you can pose your comment or question in the Q&A function in the Zoom functionality, and then I'll put it to our speakers. We are really privileged this afternoon to be joined by Dr. Genevieve Lester, who is the Serio Chair of Strategic Intelligence at the U.S. Army War College. She's also an Associate Fellow for Strategic Intelligence at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She writes on intelligence, accountability, and decision-making, and is currently working on a book on strategic intelligence, consumption, and leadership. Dr. Lester was a visiting faculty and faculty coordinator of both intelligence studies and analytic methods at the security studies program at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, as well as a senior fellow at the Center for Security Studies, also at Georgetown. Dr. Lester served as a research fellow for counterterrorism at the International Institute for Strategic Studies and as an editor of the journal International Affairs, based at Chatham House in London. Jen was also a Fulbright scholar at the Technical University here in Berlin. She also holds a PhD and MA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and MA in international economics and law from SAIS, and a BA in history, we don't want to forget that, from Colton College. She's the author of When Should State Secrets Stay Secret? Accountability, Democratic Governance, and Intelligence, published in 2015. A warm welcome to you, Jen. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for including a political scientist in your group today, too. Don't beat me. As you can tell from my title, I am very partial to Army intelligence. So I'm very pleased to be here with you today to talk about these things, because I think to a large degree they are understudied. And we in intelligence studies have a tendency to focus on particular areas and sort of view them as immutable. These are topics such as the importance of OSS that are crucial to our area. And sometimes we under-investigate those. So I really appreciate both of you and sort of disambiguating some of these themes. And you're both but just to go back for 1 second, I thought both of your books are fantastic page turners, and I can't recommend them highly enough for the detail, for the story arcs, and also for the inclusion. They're very inclusive stories with a range of stakeholders and different engagements, and the participants are fleshed out deeply. So I really appreciated that sense of there's a bigger panorama here when we're talking about these issues, and you basically address those things. And so starting with World War II, we see this coalescence of this disaggregated intelligence function. I think it was, Nick, you said it's a cottage industry. Intelligence was in all these little pieces, and that wasn't very integrated. And we see that theme overall in intelligence, integration, disintegration. We see that in Germany too, in terms of how we look at that country and what we intended to do with it. Do we take it? The war ends, and what do you do with this country? Well, you try and think of a way to govern it. So we see in both intelligence and both governance in Germany this coalescence, disaggregation, pendulum swing. And I find you both illustrate that very well. There's this sweep that's majestic in both of your pieces in terms of what are the little pieces here? How do we fix this? Well, we bring them together. And then we see this go back and forth over the course of time. So I really enjoyed that part. One thing that I see as a theme that runs through both of them, I think we can't avoid, but could be discussed, unpacked a little bit further, is the moral dimension of some of this. So we're looking at, both of you talked a little bit about, especially Thomas, the role of German Jews in the post-war world, coming into this environment. I mean, it was very obvious what had happened. The camps were being liberated. You're seeing the pictures. There are the pictures that you actually have in your book as well. And you've got this clash of morality. In that war, the good war, World War II, we're coming out of it. It's very black and white in a moral perspective. So I think that you both touch on this issue, but it could have been brought out more in both of your stories in terms of how do we think through these issues when you've got the people who with the greatest awareness of Germany, of what has happened. They're German Jews. They were targets, and they fled, many of them, and they're connected to the victims of the Holocaust. And then they're expected to explore what had happened, and then also help rebuild. And especially when we see the shift to the Soviet Union, and I love, that trajectory is fantastic. Thomas, I think especially in your book, where we see this whole transition have to happen, and it happens quickly, and it absorbs everybody. But how do you make that moral shift? That's a question I would have. Another thing is it's a little underexplored how you imbue a country such as Germany with democracy. And Thomas, you said that at the end of your talk a little bit, you had these figures that were anti-Nazi, or that were put into position, they were pro-democracy. But that's another question I have is, how do you make it effective? How do you take cultural norms from another political tradition and transfer those into a country such as Germany? We see this happen in many different countries. And I think that there are core lessons to be learned, especially in terms of, one could argue that the occupation was a success. And how was it a success? Why was it a success? What made it stand out differently than other countries that have been occupied and it didn't work out so well? And I think these are longstanding questions. Other scholars have also investigated, but we look to especially the U.S. occupation of Germany as a particularly signal moment of success. So I'm very interested in also in the cultural issues here that are brought up. For example, both of you talk about the difference in culture between the OSS and the Army Officer Corps, and I can visualize this. The OSS, oh so social, from Ivy League colleges, from elite strata of society, and the more Midwestern middle class Army Officer Corps, and how they engage with each other, and how strong these cultural traditions are, and how difficult it is to interact with one another, and the assumptions that underlie both of these cultural traditions, particularly at that time. And then again, this sort of piece of the Judaism, again, I've already mentioned this, German Jews, and how that interacts. But I work quite a bit on how do we integrate Army intelligence now into the greater operations? How do we make it as respected as the other functions of the Army? And it's still a problem. The cultural dynamics here and the relationships between the 2 and the 3, for example, there's still problems for how we think through the value that intelligence has. So these are just a few comments. I think they're both fantastic reads. Honestly, I was flipping through. I was very excited. All these new stories, the characteristics of these individuals. And Nick, I think it's a great addition to the literature to unpack the dynamics of Wild Bill a little bit more thoroughly, because I think he's taken on this iconic status that it seems a little bit impenetrable. And you break it down to look at what he actually contributed and what the dynamics were he was operating within. And I think in a lot of cases, when we're talking about these individuals, we lose the context, and both of you provide the context really well. These were individuals operating within a certain bureaucratic context and a geopolitical context, and they were pivotal. They were present at an inflection point in history and politics that was very unique. And you both illustrate that extremely well. So I'm going to move from there onto some questions that I think you've touched upon these a little bit, but I want to unpack them a little bit further. So I've got them divided up, so you each get your share here. Thomas, just to start with yours, you talk about the importance of the dynamic between the CIA and Army intelligence. And we have a tendency to consider CIA as the dominant agency. But I think, and you point out in your book and in your talk, that Army intelligence, its role was underestimated. So could you unpack that just a little further for us, that dynamic that undercuts a little bit our assumptions about the primacy of CIA at that time?
Okay, so a lot of fascinating stuff in there, and I would have to say a lot about the moral ambiguity and the Jews. I mean, maybe we can do that later, but I'm going to focus now specifically on your question about Army CIA. You're absolutely right. We do assume, just because of its name, the Central Intelligence Agency is the CIA, and therefore on top of it, as it is today, but that wasn't the case at the time. So 2 things. So first of all, the CIA was established in 1947. So that is already 2 years into the occupation. There were precursors, but it was all very shaky. You know, the OSS was dissolved, and then you have the SSU, and it was all kind of going back and forth. So the CIA in 1947 is still a very young agency. It is still an agency that is on the make. And as far as I can tell, it really comes into its own in the 1950s. So the 1947, 48, 49, these are preparatory steps for becoming the Central Intelligence Agency. So that's one. And the other one is the special situation in Germany. As I said, Germany this is a military occupation, and that's more than a name. That means the army is in charge, literally in charge. There is a 4-star Army general in charge, and then there is a 2-star general, is the director of intelligence, who sits in Berlin. And this man is formally in charge of all American intelligence operations in Europe. It doesn't always work that way, but just in terms of a chart, of a diagram, the CIA is not really the Central Intelligence Agency. So that's one thing. So the Army is simply already there. It is running all these agencies, signals intelligence, espionage, counter-espionage, what have you. And the CIA is very much a new kid on the block, and kind of can only assume a central position after this occupation is over, because it is formally, at a lower rung. So this is one thing. And then you talked about these cultural differences between the Army and the CIA, which are not helpful. The Army is, we're talking very broadly here, these are career soldiers, often Midwestern background, not Ivy Leaguers. And then you have the CIA, many of them former OSS, Ivy League, East Coast, very elitist. If you look at CIA documents at the time, they talk very disparagingly about the Army. And of course, the Army was aware of that. And so you do have this sort of personal animosity in these different cultures but they exacerbate something that's already there. Structurally, the CIA cannot be in charge of these operations. So looking at CIA is always fun and interesting. These people write extremely well. Every CIA officer writes their memoirs. Every CIA officer has a couple of biographies on him or her. In the Army, you don't find that, but that should not distract from the fact that in terms of actual operations on the ground, they are second fiddle at this time.
Thanks, Thomas. That's a great answer. Nick, here's a question for you. You touch upon it, but I think it would be valuable for the audience to explore a little further the nature of the special relationship, the relationship between the US and the UK and the development of intelligence, because I think that relationship and how you discuss it as it unwinds over the course of the war is pretty crucial to what happened then and basically the foundations of what exists today. Can you expand on that a little bit?
There's a couple hundred pages of on that in my book. There's more than one special relationship. In fact, there's a number of special relationships between American intelligence and British intelligence. And that's one of the British frustrations, is that they have to have the same meeting 2 or 3 times. They have to talk to Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, and OSS. So let me see if I can sum it up briefly. Initially, as I mentioned in my talk, Donovan doesn't want to be an intel guy. Donovan says, I'm a war hero and I want to stay a war hero. Even though I'm 57 years old, I can still lead men in combat. The British come over and they're looking around for somebody who can be sort of the point man on intelligence. And they eventually settle on him, and they groom him for the job. So there is a very strong special relationship there. They literally write the memos for him in early stages. They take him in private sessions, they tutor him, they say, okay, this is what you got to say. This is who, and they have some wild ideas that are comical in retrospect on who he should hire. Henry Luce, for instance. So there is that very strong relationship there between Donovan and the British, who are his schoolmasters. As important, or maybe more important, is the code-breaking relationship, and it starts off like it's almost like a blind date. It's like dating. They each side takes baby steps initially, shows a little bit, backs off, and as I say, it's Army and Navy separately, even though they traveled together in 1941, a delegation of fairly junior officers. The British figure out very quickly that there's 2 different agendas here, and the Army and the Navy don't get along, and they pick them up in separate cars and drive them to Bletchley Park and have separate briefings for them. But as the war goes on, especially the code breakers, all learn to work together very well. And that's what I said in my summary remarks. You at the end of the war, you've got, hey, this really works. Let's keep it going. I like to say it's almost the reverse of the normal procedure where you have a political alliance and then sort of a subset of that is the Intel alliance. This is almost the other way around, almost. And that is that the Intel alliance is so strong that if the political alliance had shuttered, you can see the Intel guys going, no, you can't do this. We're too intertwined here. So that's a very, a great operational example is the war at sea, where the British and the Americans each have separate strengths, and they combine those strengths to absolutely deadly effect to the you almost feel sorry for the U-boat fleet, because they by late 43, early 44, the numbers are just staggering. How many U-boats get sunk and how efficient. And it's not just code breaking. It's traffic analysis. It's the Jeep carrier tactics. It's the stick-to-itiveness of the pilots. I mean, imagine you're flying hour after hour over empty ocean in the hopes of spotting a U-boat. Anyway, long-winded answer, but yes, British-American Intel partnership is a huge part of the story.
Thanks. Thank you for expanding on that. Thomas, here's just to touch back on the moral ambiguity topic that we touched upon earlier. Project Paperclip and Operation Rusty, you talked about them a little bit in your presentation. Obviously, one is dealing with scientists, the other is dealing with intelligence officers. Do you want to explore the moral dimension of that a little bit?
Yes, I do. And I'm trying to make this as compact as I can, because this is one thread that goes throughout the entire book, and it really affects, not affects, but it involves intelligence at all levels. Where to start? So the short answer is, the Cold War, certainly for Operation Rusty. As I said in my talk, the Americans needed intelligence on the Soviets, and they tried to get that from wherever they could. And then, working with these German intelligence officers under Gehlen was one aspect of that. I try to emphasize in my book the intelligence that Operation Rusty procured wasn't really all that important in my estimation. It really had very little impact on American policy, just because this was low-level tactical intelligence that you could get from many places, but it had a long-term impact. I guess the thinking was that Gehlen was not someone who was principally involved as in war crimes, that type of thing. So it was okay to use him, but it's certainly true that he was a general and there were others, and these people were not supposed to be in any position, but an exception was made because the Americans or the army considered this necessary for as was a necessity of the Cold War. Paperclip is a little different in that the idea of using exploiting. So Germany was a technologically very advanced country. They had done things that we also wanted to do or wanted to learn from, for instance, rocket technology. I mean, obviously this has huge implications if you can, fire a weapon by rocket rather than a plane. So even during the war, the Americans, as did the British, and I'm sure the Soviets, planned on getting their hands on these scientists. That had nothing yet to do with the Cold War. This was simply thinking, well, we need to take advantage of this. This is the price for victory. There were policies in place. I mean, in theory, someone needed to be vetted before he was recruited for Operation Paperclip. He should not have been Nazi, should not have been involved in war crimes. And there were numerous cases where this was actually true. There were people who many German scientists would have loved to go to the United States and work for the Americans, but they were not allowed to. But it also needed to be said there were some bad people who came over. I would say Werner von Braun was a very ambivalent character. He may not have personally committed war crimes, but he did his work for the Nazis with slave labor, and many people died. And there's an interesting discussion within Army intelligence what to do with someone like that. And the people on the ground, the screeners, mostly from the counterintelligence corps, said, no, this is a Nazi. This person should not, work for us. But the higher up the decision came, the more positive he was viewed, and eventually the decision was made to bring him over. So there's a very torturous discussion within the American establishment and within Army intelligence what to do. But by the time the Cold War is in full force around 1947, these questions are not asked anymore, not because, these people the Army was morally negligent, but there were bigger imperatives at work, or so it was seen at the time.
Thanks. So, Nick, when you're talking about, we always circle back to Pearl Harbor when we talk about intelligence failure. It's sort of our core failure. But you talk about successes as well. in your book, in the story. They're pretty integral to the story, and one of them is D-Day. Can you talk a little bit about what constituted intelligence success on D-Day?
So we could have another seminar on unpacking just the words intelligence success and intelligence failure. So I could quickly dispose of this, or maybe just for the sake of this discussion, limit myself to, we had the goods, we processed them well, and we got them into the hands of the decision makers. And the example that I like to give is the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, who's a military officer, the former military attaché, who speaks German, who likes schnapps, and he likes Nazis. And Hitler chats with him. Hitler feels able to chat with him as if he's almost an equal, because it's like you meet somebody on a train or a plane and you can tell them your life story, and it doesn't really matter because they don't really plug into your life on a daily basis. That's sort of the relationship Hitler has with this guy. And he sends the reports back to Tokyo, and they're intercepted through the mechanism that was developed by Army intelligence in 1940, the more sophisticated. And one of the documents that he sends back is a 32-page report on his inspection of the West Wall. So, Pearl Harbor is different because we were being attacked and we weren't able to defend. Here we are the attacker. But we really have very good information from information that becomes intelligence and gets into the hands of the decision makers. And probably the three main sources are SIGINT, and then there's aerial intelligence, and then there's the French resistance, de Gaulle's people, and a fourth kind of an also ran is what OSS. OSS does develop information before D-Day, but compared to the others, it's like one's up here and the other is down here off the screen. So that's a partial answer to your question, but I could go on all night about intelligence failure and success.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen, for your thoughtful comments and getting the discussion going with some questions. And Thomas and Nick for responding. Let's open up to the audience. I have tons of other questions, but I want to bring in some of our audience members. We'll first go to Michael Binder. Again, if you'd like to join the conversation, you can use the raise hand function to be queued, or go to the Q&A screen and write in your comment question there. Do join us through the Q&A queue. So Michael Binder, over to you.
Okay. Hi, Nick. A question about the review of the manuscript. I assume that you had it reviewed by government agencies. Did any of them take anything out? And if so, what was the nature of the information they wanted to remain protected?
Great question. Probably for Thomas and for Nick. Nick, do you want to go to that first?
I'm sorry, I missed what you just said.
Probably the question is as much for Thomas as
both
for you.
Got it. Okay, so I used my official sources were exclusively sources that had been released, and I submitted parts of the manuscript to my agency, CIA, which is moving away from reviewing World War II information. So nobody had me take anything out. I wondered, I wondered about NSA a little bit, but again, my contacts there were like the NSA library. So I was doing things that came through them. So one of the great things about World War II is that it's 75 plus years ago now, right? So the amount of classified material, I'm guessing there's only like 1% of all files dealing with World War II that are still classified.
Thank you, Thomas.
So in my area, there is a little more that was classified. I would venture maybe 5 to 10% of the records. My book is based mostly on primary sources, official Army intelligence records. Again, most of them are available at the National Security, NARA, National Archives at College Park. And by the way, these files are really under-researched. If you're interested in early Cold War intelligence, go there and you'll have a ball. It's really amazing the kind of stuff that's there. Some files are still classified, and so my manuscript was written on a classified system and then was declassified by the Army agency INSCOM to make this available. But again, the late 1940s, with some exceptions. I mean, one exception I should mention. So, for instance, I talked about Willy Brandt, that he was an informant for the Counterintelligence Corps. That file was classified, and I found it, and then we got it into the manuscript, and now obviously its information is not classified anymore, and some other as well. But yeah, so I would say 10% maybe of the sources were classified, but now are not anymore because INSCOM reviewed them.
Thank you. Here's a question for Dr. Reynolds. An anonymous attendee writes or asks, how does Roberta Wohlstetter's seminal work on Pearl Harbor stand up after so many years?
So great question. I saw that, and I feel like I need to run back and refresh my memory. And I would say people would take footnotes. I can't give off the top of my head, I can't give you a really definitive answer, but basically Pearl Harbor boils down to an argument of whether the dots were there and whether they were connected. And if I remember right, Roberta says the dots could have been connected. And I would personally take a footnote to that and say that, the problem with a lot of this analysis is the cultural dimension. So if you're part of a culture like the US Navy that's not used to receiving intelligence, it doesn't really matter what somebody reports to you. You've got to have the habit of receiving intelligence analysis and acting on it. And so, there's this other dimension of intelligence failure at Pearl Harbor to do with sort of getting people accustomed to receiving information and acting on it, and that just wasn't there. Admiral and from the president on down, really, Admiral Kimmel would have just shrugged his shoulders if somebody had walked in and said that we've got it here, the Japanese are attacking tomorrow, and he actually had some pretty pithy comments about Japanese capabilities. So there's this other dimension. So the short answer is I would respectfully take a footnote to Roberta's work at this point.
Thank you. Let me call on Professor Thomas Schwartz for his question.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Christian. I'd like to ask both authors, each of whom commented in their presentations of the importance of signals intelligence, to maybe say a bit more about how this affected their thinking about the books that they wrote and what they've learned about the significance of signals intelligence and intelligence history.
Great question. Who would like to go first?
Let
Nick?
Thomas go first. Should I go first? I mean, I'm chronologically first, I guess.
Yeah, why don't you go first, Nick?
All right. So that's a huge question. And I think part of the answer is that when my book starts, people don't know what they don't know, and you're sort of feeling your way into a subject area, or you're going into terra incognita. There's no maps, there's no briefings, there's no nothing. And a good example, I think, is what I said about Stimson in my brief talk there, and that is Stimson says, well, we don't really know how this thing works yet, but let's look at it and see what we can come up with. And so that's how the Army progresses. And I give the Army points. I mean, but Army's asking all the right questions, and they've got, the Army in World War II, as far as I can tell, is more inclusive than the Navy, which frowns on gassed civilians working in sensitive jobs, and let alone foreigners, and of course people who are not members of the East Coast or any East Coast elite or the Midwestern, the good old boys. So it's no accident that William F. Friedman, a foreign-born Jew, works in the Army and not the Navy.
Thank you. Thomas?
Yes, great question. So one of the things that I found, picking up on what Nick said, is that when the Americans, and that's at that point the Army and the Navy, built a signals intelligence system during the war, this is a global system with stations around the globe. And what's fascinating is it was not necessarily only directed at the enemy. They noticed that they picked up a lot of stuff from all sorts of countries, and they explicitly say, let's collect on everybody, including our allies. So, for instance, France was a great source of intelligence because their communications were not very secure. And so, as the war came to an end, and this is before the Cold War, there was any sign of a Cold War, the Army in particular says, this is such a great system, we're going to keep this. And we're going to make use of the occupied territories in Germany and Japan to make this global signals intelligence system permanent. So in 1945 or 46, they set up the Army Security Agency Europe in Frankfurt and the Army Security Agency Pacific in Japan, and then it goes to the Philippines, because there are no legal constraints there. You can intercept anything you want because this is under American territory. And then they build this global system. And then, of course, the Cold War happens, and it ends up being directed mostly at the Soviet Union, but it was never designed to target only the Soviet Union or the Soviet bloc. It was always designed to be a global system. And Germany, and I suppose Japan, which I haven't studied, become central monitoring posts. It takes the Army in Germany a while to set this up, to sort of reconfigure it from a wartime setting, which is mostly tactical, to a sort of permanent listening post into the Soviet bloc. But by 1948, this system is operational. And starts collecting mostly, radio traffic from across the Iron Curtain, especially on the Soviet forces there, and starts to play a real role. And as many of you will know, Berlin, of course, then becomes perhaps the most important signals intercept station of the Cold War in the Teufelsberg, and other stations in West Germany as well. So it's this continuity from World War II to the Cold War, this global approach. These were not, unlike the CIA, this was not a Cold War effort. And so it's also not surprising that perhaps, this continues unabated. But there's a great story of continuity there. And quite frankly, also foresight to see how valuable signals intelligence could be, no matter who your enemy is.
Thank you. James McNaughton, Thomas, has a question. It appears that in the spring of 1948, Army intelligence failed to give clear warning of Soviet plans and preparations for blockading Berlin. What accounts for this? He asks.
You have to be careful what I say. James McNaughton is my former boss, so I'll phrase this carefully. Jim, thank you very much for attending this event. And by the way, Jim also gave me some great input for the book, so I'm glad to see him here. So first of all, I wouldn't necessarily say that that Army intelligence wasn't aware of that. I think starting in 1947, there are people in Army intelligence who say, that Berlin is very exposed. Maybe they didn't predict a total blockade. And maybe can I just pull up my slideshow one more time just to show this a little bit to people. Let's see, share. So if you want to take a look at the map and take a look at Berlin, you'll see that Berlin is completely surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory, and you have the three western sectors. The southernmost sector is the U.S. sector, and in 1948, the Soviets decide to blockade this West Berlin island. But I wouldn't say the army intelligence didn't predict it. There were people who were. This was an ongoing discussion. You know, Berlin is exposed, and how are we going to provide if something happens? I think the bigger problem is more that policymakers weren't listening. Lucius de Clay, the military governor, was an extremely smart man. However, he really did not listen to his intelligence agency. This is a recurring problem. The intelligence agencies told him one thing, he was simply dismissing it. The bigger problem becomes when once this blockade starts, what is the Soviet goal? Is this a prequel to war? And that was a very real concern. And army intelligence says very clearly, no, it's not. The Soviets do not want to go to war. This is this is brinkmanship. This is power play. This is political posturing. But we have no indications that the Soviets are going to start a war. Again, not everybody is listening to that at the time, but that was a very accurate prediction. Another thing that the army intelligence also said, one of the thoughts was, if you're dealing with this blockade, well, maybe we should have an armed convoy that goes from the American zone, across the Soviet zone into Berlin. The Soviets are not going to do anything about this, and then we keep the roads open. And army intelligence says, no, if you do this, the Soviets will respond, and they probably would have. So I would say, actually, army intelligence comes off pretty well during the Berlin blockade, and has, to the extent that they were listened to, a calming effect on this crisis, so it wouldn't spiral out of control.
Thanks, Thomas. Very, very interesting. Question for Dr. Reynolds from Lieutenant Colonel Tim Moore. He says, I'm currently serving as a strategic intelligence planner in the U.S. Army Special Operations Command G2 at Fort Bragg. I was intrigued by your comment alluding to the contest between intelligence operations and special operations and conventional warfare during World War II. That is an issue we often still suffer from today. We'll explain that a bit more, and which do you think habitually won out over the other? Nick.
So I think it goes back and forth, and it depends on the time frame that you're looking at. That one kind of operation takes precedence over the other. So I want to confine myself to answering it in terms of World War II. If you just look at OSS, you see a preference for special ops, and then sort of close behind is what we would call covert action today. If you look at the U.S. government in World War II, I would say the preference is on the side of signals intelligence, so intelligence in general, as opposed to special operations. So one of the tricks of looking at this in World War II is nobody asked these questions in exactly this way of the participants. General Marshall, Admiral King, Admiral Nimitz. Nobody sat down and did an oral history of them and said, so what do you think of these things? Which would you prefer? Did you get what you wanted? The situation is complicated because they were reluctant to talk about signals intelligence because of the classifications involved. So short answer, I think in World War II, the edge went to intelligence for the sake of information. But it's hard to give you a definitive answer.
Thank you. A couple of questions that address this. issue of moral ambiguity that Dr. Lester already brought up. Spencer Mickles writes, the State Department was known for its anti-Semitism. What about the intelligence community during this era? This is for both of you. It ties in with a question by Matthew Fink, who writes that, who wonders, did OSS and Army intelligence differ in their attitude towards German Jews who are working for them?
So I can't answer the second one, so I will leave that one to Thomas. The first one, I touched on this a little bit earlier. My sense is that the Army intelligence was especially code breaking, was an organization or a culture that embraced people of all creeds and religions, and I think there's this little, I get the sense there's this little, I don't know, bubble of there's a good bubble there in Army intelligence. I don't know about the rest of the Army. I don't really have a sense for OSS whether there was a certainly, maybe the way to look at a lot of these is there's a scholar who looked at in great detail on the women of OSS and came to the conclusion that the OSS personnel policy towards women was, quote, not regressive. So maybe that's the phrase that we could apply to anti-Semitism or the whole question of whether an American Jew could be comfortable in OSS. So sorry, it's an incomplete answer, but I'll stand by for sure that if you're Jewish and you're good at code breaking, the Army is a good place for you in World War II.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, it's a difficult. I think there's not one size fits all answer. I do think the Army, because it is the biggest service and because it is perhaps also the most diverse service in the sense of the people coming in there from different walks of life, it's a reflection of American society. American society at that time, it has to be said, there was a strain of anti-Semitism. And to the extent that existed in American society, that also existed in the US Army. My personal impression is it wasn't any stronger than that. So it was not particularly anti-Semitic than, perhaps a more elitist service was. The big discussion in the Army, of course, was the question of desegregation. How should Black American soldiers serve? And that, I think, absorbed a lot of the discussion at the time about, how this Army was supposed to function. The special thing about the Army and Army intelligence is, of course, that so many German Jews served in it. There was an intelligence. So the Army trained its intelligence personnel for Europe at Camp Ritchie in Maryland. And the people who graduated there, they're old men, then came to be known as the Ritchie Boys. I want to say that about 10% of the graduates of the Ritchie School were German, most of them German Jews. So this is a large percentage. And then you have these people who perform absolutely critical functions in the war. Most of them serve as POW interrogators. Nobody can do the job as well as these German Jewish emigres, and you do find that in memoirs appreciated. Many of these people have also written their memoirs, and I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture here, but anti-Semitism doesn't figure much in there. Now, it could be that they haven't written about it, but my sense is this was not as big a problem, especially during the war, and what they did was really acknowledged by the U.S. Army, including the Army Officer Corps. And Henry Kissinger, I think he was described by one of his comrades in the Army. You cannot imagine a more American guy than this Henry Kissinger. I mean, this is really where he became an American, and this is how he described it himself. regards to OSS, I can't really say. I just know too little about it. I know they had also men like Peter Sickel, German Jews who then worked for them. Mr. Sickel, who, by the way, was the first CIA station chief in Berlin after the war. He's still alive. He just turned 100 years old, sharp as a tack. I conducted many interviews with him. He speaks very highly of the CIA leadership, especially for the 1950s, how they protected him against McCarthyism. McCarthyism, that was partly directed at Jews who are quote unquote different. And he said the CIA leadership, Alan Dulles, took care of their own people. So this is an incomplete answer, but my sense is that yes, certainly there was anti-Semitism, but it wasn't as big of a problem as it could have been, or maybe if it was in the State Department, with which I'm not that familiar. But I think the Army, with this particular aspect, dealt perhaps better than the State Department.
Thank you. Paul Chamberlain asks, how much was there among intelligence officers during World War II that the Soviet Union was likely to be an adversary after Germany's defeat? I know March-April 1945 is a major turning point among the top US leadership, but I'm interested to know if intelligence officers had any earlier inklings of the coming antagonism. Would like to take that on.
I can, maybe Nick, you want to go first because then we're at the chronological.
So my answer is really quick. J. Edgar Hoover was way more suspicious of the Soviets than Donovan was. Donovan dealt with them to a certain extent at arm's length. He actually went to Moscow in late 1943, early 1944, and met with the head, their director of operations, and the guy who had been the head of the illegal station in New York a few years earlier under alias. So, but J. Edgar Hoover said, "Nah, we can't work with these people." So he shut it down. That's a partial answer. I think once again OSS didn't know what it didn't know at that point. So I will yield the floor to Thomas, who I'm sure can give us a good answer.
Yeah, thank you. I really think there's a distinctive difference between OSS and Army intelligence. The Army, for one, was a conservative institution that was traditionally anti-communist. I think that, if you like, helped assessing the Soviets realistically. And I think by and large, they didn't fall as much in love with Joseph Stalin as Donovan did. You also have what used to be the military attaché, then it becomes the military mission in Moscow. So these are Army officers serving in Moscow who become extremely frustrated with the Soviets. If I may, I'm just going to read a very quick note from General Joseph Mikela, who was part of this mission in 1943. And he says, the Soviets, he's writing this home to the War Department, the Soviets intend to push their claims in Europe even to the extent of resorting to armed force the day the war with Germany ends. And then he concludes, we need to stiffen our attitudes towards the Soviets. This is long past due. So this was in 1943. So no, I would say the Army intelligence had an early understanding of what the Soviet peril might be after the war. The first Army intelligence chief in Germany, General Edwin Seibert, was very perceptive, and he started collecting information systematically on the Soviet armed forces really in the summer of 1945, just a month after the end of the war. And I would say that is really to the great credit, because it turned out to be quite prophetic.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're at the end of our session. We could have clearly gone on for much longer. But let me just thank you, Thomas, Nick, and Jen for presentations. As always, of course, Eric as well. And to Eric, for the last word. Eric.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you, everyone. In drawing the session to a close, let me remind you that the Washington History Seminar returns next week, but not on a Monday, but rather on a Thursday. In this case, December 8th at 4 p.m. for the session on a new book by William Inboden, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, with discussants Paula Dobriansky and Melvin Leffler. We hope you can join us. Till then, take care, be safe, and good night.